So yeah, I've been fortunate to work in this area for over a decade now. And so when Stefan asked me if I could give an opening keynote, I decided to sort of take a sort of data-centric view. So okay, before I start, I should acknowledge that what I'll be presenting is joint work with many people. I mean, this is really I've been fortunate to work with people in academia, but also at UN agencies and NGOs. I'll just pick out sort of two names in particular. So there's Emilio Zacchini, who's currently a research director at the Max Planck Institute for demographic research, and there's also my long-term friend and collaborator, Kieran Garimella, who both really contributed to this line of work over the last a decade or so. So I want to start by briefly reflecting on what makes a good research project. And there are many ingredients, but I'll focus on sort of three. So one, at least to me personally, is relevance, right? So hopefully what you do has relevance that goes ideally beyond academia, right? So at least I like to always reflect on, so what will be the impact of my work, right? And some people only approach their research from this angle, right? So they might start with a sort of broadly defined project. Okay, let's study Ukrainian migration. Like, clearly, there's sort of relevance and impact. So let's go with a relevance angle first. Another aspect, of course, is then sort of the data aspect, right? So if you want to study something, hopefully there's some sort of data, right? Sort of to analyze, right? So you should sort of think critically and sort of creatively about the type of data that you will use, right? And some research are very sort of data centric, right? So and I used to be a Twitter guy for a while, right? So okay, let's start with Twitter data and we'll figure out the rest later, right? So that's another sort of approach, right? And then, of course, last but not least, there's the actual method, right? So how, once you have sort of data and once you have hopefully like a research question of relevance, how do you actually analyze them, right? And of course, especially in computer science, you have many people who are sort of very method centric, right? Like so I'm a computer vision guy, or maybe you're an expert on sentiment analysis, right? So I want to do sentiment analysis, and let's go and find some data I can apply sentiment analysis to, right? In this talk, I will focus mostly on the data aspect, but of course the data is also tied to the other things, so there will also be elements of the methods part. But I'd be happy to sort of talk about the first element also later in the the Q&A, as well as in the coffee break. So the structure of the talk will basically be a sort of run through different experience reports, reporting on work using different types of data sources. So I'll spend quite a bit of work looking at sort of Facebook advertising data, then satellite imagery, geotag tweets, and then time allowing some other data sources that we've used over the past decade or so. So in a nutshell, so the goal of this talk is kind of to see all of Europe in a week, which might be a bit of a big ask. So if you Google if this is even plausible, right, you come up with sort of epic itineraries. So hopefully this will be like a bit of a sort of epic speed run through the topic. So with that in mind, let's get moving. So first data source I want to talk about is Facebook advertising data. And actually, for those who haven't seen this before live, I'd like to start by making this as concrete as possible. So what you see here is Facebook's advertising platform. So this is publicly accessible for free. So you have access to this as long as you have a Facebook account without paying a single cent, right? And so here I'm at the step of creating an advertising campaign where I get to select my target audience, right? So who is it that should see my ad in the end, right? And so far I've selected Facebook users living in a part of Colombia that's called Norte de Santander, which is on the border with Venezuela. So you have sort of Venezuela in the east, and then sort of the rest of Colombia in the southwest, right? So far I've just selected Facebook users aged 18 and above, all genders, and otherwise no further sort of limitation. And now the crucial thing to observe is this thing here on the right, right? So Facebook provides a so-called audience estimate. Hopefully you can sort of see this. It has 1 to 1.2 million users, where Facebook estimates how many people match your targeting criteria. Okay? So this essentially gives you a real-time, no-cost digital census over almost 3 billion Facebook users. Right? Where you can sort of ask of the Facebook user population, how many match certain criteria, right? So for example, of these 1.2 million people, how many are women, right? So for example, in some of our other work, we look at digital gender gaps, right? Sort of, so who has access to sort of Facebook, right? And here it's sort of split roughly equally down the middle, right? Which is great. But now from a migration point of view, you can also look at how many of these Facebook believes to have lived in another country, in particular, where Facebook believes that they used to live in Venezuela, right? So now we're just looking at women in this part of Colombia who used to live in Venezuela, right? And again, without paying anything, Facebook provides an estimate, right? And so the question is, how good is this estimate, right? How is it obtained? Or sort of, those are not sort of questions to look at, right? But this is the sort of the key data source that we use for a lot of this work. Maybe just to make it a bit more, even more concrete, I'll show you some data visualizations around this. So this is data we collected just 4 years ago, or sort of quite a while, almost sort of 5 years ago already. In this case for New York City, right? So suppose you didn't know anything at all about the city and you wanted to understand a wealth distribution, right? Then you could look at just data from Facebook's advertising platform and look at the distribution of devices that are used to access Facebook. So let me try to explain what you sort of see here. So according to data that's pre-collected, again, it was collected almost 5 years ago, in sort of Manhattan and Midtown, about 90% of Facebook users are using iOS devices to connect to Facebook, right? So generally iOS devices are more expensive than other types of devices, right? So if you go back, right? If you compare this with the area of the sort of the Bronx, where it's about sort of 40%, right? So just looking at the device types, you would probably assume that there's a sort of wealth differential between these two areas, right? Or looking at the sort of migration background, you could look at where do people live now who used to live in Latin America in the past, and you would see that according to sort of this Facebook advertising data, again, sort of in parts of the Bronx, about sort of 40% of Facebook users used to live in Latin America, right? And you can sort of find this out for any place in the world, sort of in pretty much real time for free. Of course, here just it's sort of pre-collected to have a nice visualization, right? Of course, in the case of New York City, of course, you have good open government data. You don't need any, of this sort of toy data. But in other parts of the world, you don't necessarily have open government data, right? So for example, this includes the city of Doha in Qatar, where I'm from. You don't have zip codes, which you have to sort of use other types of geographic targeting, right? So if you, for example, you wanted to understand the situation of Nepali migrant workers, you can look at, Facebook users who used to live in Nepal, right, where they're predominantly found. They're predominantly found in the so-called industrial area. Now, again, there's no official sort of ground truth you can validate this against, but if you Google sort of industrial area Doha, you would see that this area was built to house people from South and Southeast Asia, sort of. So, and certainly this also sort of aligns with my experience living in the city, right? They're almost all men, very young, right, which is a blessing during COVID times, and almost all Android device users, right? Very few can afford iOS devices. If you contrast this with people from other backgrounds, for example, Western Europe and North America, I live right here, right, which is quite typical for people like me, sort of, also in a high-rise building. It's roughly gender balanced. I can bring over my wife and my daughter. A lot of university graduates, older people. These are sort of knowledge experts, let's say, and more iOS than Android device users, right? Just to sort of show you what you can sort of do again for free for anywhere in the world. But of course, the question is, how good is this, right? Is this actually sort of good, meaningful data? So we spent quite a lot of time trying to sort of to validate this data and sort of see when it can be used and for which purposes, right? So this is a figure from a study that we did in 2017 or so, right? Where we looked at data from the US at the US state level from different sort of countries of origin. So for example, for this data point here is for people who used to live in Mexico, now living in California, right? So it's a combination of sort of country of origin and host state in the US. And now you have these two dimensions, sort of. So on the y-axis, you have a sort of arguably ground truth from the American community survey, right? So what's the percentage of the total population that now lives in California that's born in Mexico, right? And on the x-axis, we have to show the equivalent of sort of what's the percentage of Facebook users who match this criteria, right? And you can certainly, it's not a perfect match, right? But it's also not that far off, right? Just as a sort of a first step, right? And probably, so here, I think I have this sort of, so here, right? So this is the area where Facebook would underestimate, right? Like sort of, right? So in most areas, probably Facebook would underestimate the percentage of migrants, right? But maybe there's some combinations where Facebook overestimates. If you look at it sort of at a global level, it's now a similar plot, but just slightly different meaning. So now every data point is a host country, like a whole country, no longer a state. And the percentage is just the total percentage of population or sort of Facebook users that are either foreign-born or that used to live abroad, right? So there's already sort of this slight disconnect in terms of definitions. And so first, this is the identity line. This is already a regression line. This is the identity line. And so now these are areas where Facebook underestimates, and these are areas where Facebook overestimates. So let me try to walk you sort of through what you see here. So these data points in red are different countries in Africa, right? And so for countries in Africa, typically migrants, so if you move to Kenya, then you are more likely to be on Facebook than the other residents, right? So this means that in those sort of locations, Facebook would typically overestimate migrants, right? And then if you look at sort of other locations, so Europe, it's sort of already less of an overestimation issue, right? But see, so there are certain geographical patterns that appear to be non-random, right? So hopefully there's some sort of thing you can model by understanding the selection biases. So drilling even deeper, so at these sort of selection biases, again going now back to the US. Here's a graph that sort of looks at age and gender-specific biases. So on the left you have data for men, on the right you have data for women, on top you have data for California, at the bottom you have data for Texas, right? So let's look at just this, here we look at men living in California, okay? According to the ACS, in the age group 40 to 44, about 20% of men in this age group were born in Mexico, right? So this is quite a bit higher than Facebook's estimates, right? Which might be sort of around 15% or so, right? But now, so first you see, generally the older the age, the bigger the gap to a degree, so Facebook underestimates older Mexicans, right? Like in general, right? But then at the youngest age, you'd see that this gap actually disappears, right? And at the very, very youngest age group, actually Facebook comes up with a bigger estimate, right? Which is also interesting, so what might be going on there. But now the crucial thing to observe is that this sort of, the pattern of the bias is somewhat consistent, right? It's sort of consistent more or less across sort of genders and even across locations, right? So that again, hopefully you can sort of model this bias, so assuming you have it for some locations, right? Hopefully you can then learn the sort of the debiasing formula and apply it to other locations, right? And so one simple way to do this is a very, very simple way, right? So if you suppose you wanted to sort of predict the percentage foreign born in a given location for a particular age and gender group, for a particular country of birth, and for a particular sort of target state, right? So then you just put everything together, right? So first order approximation is just, okay, what's going on Facebook? And then you add certain bias terms, right? So maybe certain countries of origin are over or underrepresented, certain age groups are over and underrepresented, etc., right? And so with this simple sort of correction, so you evaluate it in an out-of-sample manner. You bring down the percentage error from sort of 56% to sort of 37%, right? Using a very, very simple model that doesn't even look at sort of GDP or internet penetration or a language spoken, right? So clearly this seems to be like a quite powerful sort of data source for this. Now, so after validating this, right, so broadly that there seems to be a strong signal, we've been using it operationally, working with UN partners in different contexts. And so here I'll talk about our experience working in the Venezuelan context in a second, right? And so let me walk you through what you sort of see here. So everything here is for Facebook users who used to live in Venezuela. Okay, so here we're only talking for people from Venezuela, and everything else is for a different host country or host region, right? So for example, let's look at the data in red, right? So now we're looking at people from Venezuela living in Colombia. If you look at this bar down here, the lower estimate is just the raw number of active Facebook users who lived in Venezuela at this time, right? So this is sort of when the data was collected in June 2018. So that's just the raw estimate. Now that's likely to be an underestimate, right? Because probably not all of the Venezuelan migrants are on Facebook, right? And so if we assume that there are no false positives here, we somehow have to correct for the sort of Facebook penetration, right? Now we don't know the exact Facebook penetration among Venezuelan migrants, so now we make a big assumption, right? We assume that it's the same as among the Colombian host population. Right, so if we assume that in all of Colombia the Facebook penetration is 60%, then there's sort of 40% missing. Right, so this is now this sort of very simple correction. Right, so we're assuming so it's the same as in the host country. We're missing the 40%. Right, so if, under that assumption, this would be the actual number of sort of Venezuelan migrants. Right, and then we sort of monitor this across time, and we can sort of see how it sort of differs among host countries and host regions. Again, the question is how good are these estimates, right? Like so what's the sort of ground truth to compare against, right? I mean, nobody knows for sort of sure, but if you compare against different UN estimates, so this is now for all of Latin America. This is sort of the gray bar, right? Some of just raw numbers correcting for Facebook penetration. You'd sort of see that there's broadly similar estimates to UN reports, but probably higher sort of or so. Now, again, ultimately we don't know for sure, who's right or who's wrong, sort of. But certainly at least plausible, right, that it might actually be higher than the numbers in these reports. Right? Also interesting that even within the UN system, right, depending on methodology, you have sort of different estimates that are derived. To validate it a bit more, we also work with partners in Colombia, actually sort of so, who also helped to get data from the Colombian government at the time. And so here, this is now at a sort of sub-national level, right? So here on the left, you have numbers of Venezuelan migrants according to self-registration, right? So they were basically asked, please come and register yourself, make yourself sort of counted, right? And this is then the data that's sort of plotted here. On the right, you have data that was collected around the same time using this Facebook advertising. Right, and if you sort of zoom out, okay, there's some sort of similarity, right? Sort of Norte de Santander, it's quite high in both areas. But then further away from the border, Facebook, differs quite a bit from official estimates, right? And again, the question is sort of who's wrong, who's right. Because we were working with people in Colombia, they actually came back to us and just said, this is actually more in line with what we observe on the ground than this, right? And their explanation was that the self-registration efforts were much more pronounced on the border and not so much further inland, So it's quite likely that the government was undercounting people further away from the border, right? Which is then sort of interesting, right? That this big data company has probably better migration data than the government, right? Like sort of also, right? I mean, arguably, right? And we don't know for sure, but there's at least some pretty reasonable evidence, I would say, that this is the case. But you can also go beyond just the number, and you can try to understand the socioeconomic situation, looking now at the device type, what I showed before. So let me try to walk you through this plot here. So again, everything is for Facebook users who used to live in Venezuela, who at the time of the data collection were living in a different country, let's say Chile, or even part of a country such as Sao Paulo or Roraima in Brazil. Now the order of these plots, of these bars, is according to the percentage of Venezuelan Facebook users using iOS devices, so Apple devices. So to make this specific, so Facebook users from Venezuela in Roraima, Brazil, which is sort of on the border that you would typically walk to, they are very, very unlikely to use Apple devices. Only 3% of those have access to, generally more expensive devices. At the other end of the sort of chart, people who make it all the way to the United States, well, the majority of them use iOS devices, right? So this is sort of induces the order, somewhat oversimplifying sort of from poor to rich in a sense. Now the question is, how do we get to this Y value, right? Like how do we actually try to assign like a dollar number to these sort of percentages, right? And so for this, we trained a regression model to predict country level per capita GDP, right? So we sort of said, okay, can we predict the per capita GDP of Argentina using only the percentage of iOS users among the Facebook users in Argentina? Okay, so we trained a regression model. It's just using a single variable, right? What's going on Facebook users in terms of iOS users. This simple model works quite well. So it explains almost close to 90% of the variation in per capita GDP. And this model is then applied to these subsets, right? This model is just a mapping of percentage iOS to per capita GDP, and this then sort of gives this number, right? So if Venezuelans in Chile were a country, right, that country would have a per capita GDP of about 18,000 US dollars. Now the precise dollar value is, it's not meant to be precise, but we tried different sort of model variations or sort of so. And at least we always come up with these three groups, right, where we are reasonably confident to say that, yeah, maybe not this relative order, we don't know, but we are quite confident to say that these people are probably worse off in a sort of socioeconomic sense, sort of, right? So these are mostly neighboring countries, often, maybe walking to. These are people mostly still in sort of Latin America, and then people who make it all the way to the US or Spain in general, right, in aggregate, are probably of less concern than people, just sort of next door in the jungle. So that's all, seems, oh, great, promising, fantastic, right? Everything sort of solved, right? Well, not quite. So it also shows some of the challenges, right? Because we were sharing this data operationally, we created like a very simple dashboard that was used by UNHCR and others, where in this case shows data for Brazil, right? So again, Venezuelan Facebook users in Brazil disaggregated in various ways. But just look at the headline, the number on top, right? You could see the number sort of going up, but then suddenly at some point it goes down, right? Like sort of so, right? So, okay, that's interesting. So what was going on in February, March 2019, right? Was it like return migration? Were people moving on from Brazil to Argentina or sort of so? Well, no, actually what was happening at the time is that Facebook changed its algorithm of how they classify Venezuelans. All right, so just from one day to the next, they do, okay, well, now it's a new number, right? How do we know for sure that that's what's happening and not actual thing? Well, we only know because we are collecting such data globally, regularly for all combinations, like how many Germans are living in Qatar, sort of, so, right? And at exactly the same point in time, we saw all of those numbers suddenly go down, right? So suddenly there are fewer Germans living in Qatar, fewer Venezuelans in Argentina, fewer Mexicans in Germany, whatever, sort of, so, right? And so this, well, that's, it doesn't make any sense, sort of, so, right? And so we are quite confident to say that this is just an algorithmic change, right? And this is, of course, one of the key limitations. Like we sit on top of this black box, seems to be a powerful, useful black box, but that black box can change any day, right? Like sort of, right? And so, how do you deal with this sort of? So that's a key limitation when doing this type of work. I want to go away from this sort of estimating, raw migration flows to talk a bit about more what you can do more on this sort of, not to say qualitative side, but beyond raw numbers. And so, for example, we also try to look at issues related to sort of assimilation, sort of, right? Like so let me try to explain this, right? So you can also target people on Facebook based on what they're interested in, right? So you can, for example, look at what are Germans living in Germany interested in on Facebook, right? And let's say 90% are interested in football, 70% are interested in the scientist Max Planck, 40% are interested in sauerkraut. Right, so I'm allowed to make this joke because I'm German. Okay, great. Okay, so that's sort of like typical aggregate German interests of Germans in Germany, sort of, right? Now you can sort of compare this. What about sort of Arabs living in the MENA region, right? So maybe 80% of them are interested in the Holy Quran, 60% are interested in Ibn al-Haytham, like a famous scientist from the region. 60% are interested in falafel, one of my sort of favorite foods after living there. Right? Now the question is. Right, so this gives you kind of like a scale. So what about now Arabs living in Germany, sort of? So where do they sort of fall in terms of this sort of spectrum, right? Do they sort of pick up? Do their food preferences change, or sort of so, right? Like sort of so, right? And of course this is, methodologically there are many questions around this, right? Does this even make sense? How would you measure this, right? For example, one important thing to consider is what sort of interests should you consider, right? Like at some level, we are all the same, right? If I ask you, do you like music? Probably, right? Some kind of music, right? Do you like technology? Probably, right? But then if you really drill down, maybe I'm into Puerto Rican style salsa and you're into New York style salsa, so we are completely different, sort of, also, right? So sort of, is this now the same or the different? How do you measure these kind of things, right? So there are a lot of caveats, happy to discuss this, but just to show you can always come up with some score, right? Like, and again, there are a lot of caveats around the score, right? Where you can sort of now compare them, right? So think of something like sort of cosine similarity in essence, right? For example, Austrians living in Germany are quite close to Germans, where like a higher score means they're sort of similar, right? Sort of so. And then Spanish people living in Germany, etc. Right? Then you sort of go down further. The list sort of people in Turkish are less similar, right? And then here you have now Arabic-speaking migrants who are women without a university degree, somewhat older, right? They are sort of most dissimilar, whereas Arabic migrants who are men with a university degree, slightly younger, are relatively more similar, right? And again, this is, I'm not saying this is truth in any sort of sense. It's sort of like a very, very early sort of exploration, right? Like, and it would also be interesting to look at what are bridging interests, right? Maybe people who maybe if they become interested in the local soccer club, do they also pick up other German interests, right? Maybe are there sort of pathways to sort of assimilation. Also the question is even if people should assimilate, if assimilation is good, right? That's another thing. I mean, I live in Qatar where the whole country is set up basically for me not to assimilate, right? I mean, I've lived there for 9.5 years, I still don't speak Arabic, right? So, but anyway, happy to discuss all of these things. Another thing, I mean, this is still more on the measuring side, sort of, or something I should have the slide earlier, sort of, or so. Right, so now it's okay, what about Ukraine, right? So can you use this data for Ukraine? So this is a joint work with the University of Oxford, and it's led by Douglas Leisure. So what we're doing here is we're looking at internal displacement. So not necessarily yet out migration, but internal displacement. And what we're sort of doing here is we're looking at changes in basically daily Facebook users, right? So how many people are using Facebook today in Kiev, right? What about tomorrow? What about a week ago? What about a month ago, right? Like, what about Kharkiv, right? How does it sort of change across the country, right? So we start with this, and then we add a model to account for the population who's not on Facebook, right? The children. This is sort of where a certain assumption, right? So basically mapping between the number of women in a certain range and the children in a certain range, right? This is a strong modeling assumption. And then on top of this, we are sort of correcting for changes in Facebook penetration, right? Because maybe the internet goes down overall, or, you know, due to infrastructure damage, etc. So happy to talk about that more later. But then with all of this, you can actually come up with something like this, right? Where for a given location in Ukraine, you have a sort of population pyramid over time, right? Where at this particular date, more or less, sort of, so maybe plus minus a week, you can sort of see how does the pre-war population compare to the current population. Okay, this was still more on the numeric side or sort of estimation side, jumping back again more to something more related to integration, assimilation. This is work we're currently doing with Aparut Kauta at the University of Hanover, where we are looking at what are characteristics of people on Facebook who are likely to be non-Muslims, but who are friends with people who are Muslims. Okay, how can we get this information? You know, so well, Facebook has or used to have the targeting criteria for friends of people who have engaged with Ramadan. Okay, and this includes people who are engaging in Ramadan themselves, right? So I can look at who has friends who celebrate Ramadan but does not celebrate Ramadan themselves. Right? What are sort of the characteristics of those, right? Sort of so, right? And now, you know, if you have such a friend, that might just mean you have a lot of friends. But if you have 10,000 people on Facebook, probably one of them will sort of, you know, celebrate Ramadan. So we have to correct for overall Facebook network size, right? And so how do we do this? Well, you can target people based on whether one of their friends has an upcoming birthday, sort of. And so basically, right? And so the more friends you have, the more likely one of them has an upcoming birthday, right? So we can sort of correct one for this, right? And just to this is still ongoing work, but at least it's already quite clear that it seems that younger age is a positive factor. So that the younger you are, the more likely you seem to have these sort of intercultural, let's say, I don't know how to call them, connections. And also higher education seems to be a positive thing. But then there's a lot of geographic patterns across sort of European cities that we're still trying to disentangle. Now again, talking about the limitations of this sort of work, right? This is very interesting, and I'm somewhat excited about this. But then again, Facebook changes things, right? So it's not static, right? So earlier this year they announced some changes, right? The highlight is remove things related to religion, right? So if you wanted to collect this data now, you can no longer do this, sort of. So this is, you see these symbols a bit later in the talk a couple of times, right? So again, so now again, we're fortunate we collected this data early enough, but we would not be able to replicate this or do this again going forward. And then I think the last thing I have on the Facebook thing is now targeted online service. So this is, of course, Stefan in the room is probably the world's expert on this. The only twist of our work to this is that we actually want to start with qualitative research. So currently, my colleague Sophie Richter is actually in Greece and Italy talking to Syrian migrants about issues related to access to health systems, right? And then the plan is that through this, in-depth interviews that will generate hypotheses, and then we would like to test these hypotheses on a larger scale and maybe add some nuance to this, right? And so we then create a survey, or the first draft of such a survey, and that will then be sort of disseminated through sort of targeted ads on Facebook, right? We're likely to be sort of Syrians in Greece and Italy would sort of see this survey and be asked to sort of to take it. Again, we're not the first. Again, Stefan would know much more about this sort of work. Right? We're doing this related to access to health. Great. So this was all about Facebook advertising data. The rest will be much quicker. So the next data source is something you might not have thought about as a sort of migration-related data. Was actually satellite imagery. So again, let me try to show this quite concretely. So we have access to data from a company called, not now, okay, I'm not going to change my password now. Okay, sorry for this. Okay, well, you've seen satellite imagery before, so you know what it looks like, right? So it's sort of, this is the sort of the satellite imagery that you're used to from Google Earth, etc. And this is just what the platform looks like, right? This is, I think, Chernihiv in Ukraine, and you can sort of see different sort of snapshots across time, right? So what are we doing with this, right? We're not looking for building damage or trying to detect artillery or something. No, we're doing something simpler, right? We are counting cars, and so here's an example from Syria, where we started this before the Ukrainian sort of war, right? Where you sort of see, okay, here in a certain time period there are cars visible, in another time period there are no cars visible, right? Sort of so, and assuming cars are driven by people, right? That probably means some people have disappeared, sort of, right? And so we don't do this automatically, but now there's sort of the computer science element to it, right? So we use sort of computer vision to do this sort of for all the city and sort of to detect all of these cars automatically, right? So this I can maybe show you at least, right? So here's something for Kharkiv, right before the war, right? So there are a lot of cars, along the roads and sort of other locations, right? And now doing this, we would sort of look, how does it change over time, right? How does the number of visible cars change, right? And so here, this is before the war, a certain area, again, because the area visible also changes. Sometimes there's cloud coverage, sometimes the satellite only takes part of the city snapshot, sort of so. And then there's sort of different thresholds in terms of confidence thresholds for the algorithm, sort of so. But then for any different threshold, we sort of count the number of cars per square kilometer, right? So this is sort of the pre-war. Ignore the setting where there's not enough coverage if you look at square kilometer, but these other two snapshots are comparable. And you'd see how dramatically the number of cars per square kilometer has dropped, right? Between sort of pre-war and sort of a current war, sort of so, right? And again, we're sort of continuing to collect such sort of data, right? Where we can sort of do it. And of course, not just in this case, it's for Kherson. You can sort of do this for other cities, right? Here's now Lviv in the west, where you actually see it has gone up, right? So this is pre-war car density, and at this time of collection, over 60 car density has gone up, right? So this would probably indicate that people have, moved, have probably left Kherson, but might now be more likely to be in Lviv. I'm again mighty excited about this sort of work. At the moment, one limiting factor is the update frequency. So this sort of imagery you certainly don't have every day. Depends, during the height of the war was available more or less every week. Now the frequency has gone down to maybe once every 3 weeks or so. So it's gone down quite a bit. But we're also trying to do this with lower resolution satellite imagery, which would be available daily, even with a lag of a couple of hours, right? So we could potentially do this like, by noon I could tell you the car density in the morning. So that's sort of the goal. The last in-depth thing I want to talk about is sort of geotag tweets. This is probably you're most familiar with, right? So you can sort of, if you tag, sometimes there's location, right? So here I tweeted this morning, and there was a location assigned to my tweet. And so here I'll just mention a work that's interesting from a methodological point of view, because here we're looking at how definitions change your results, right? So when you talk about migrations, well, like, how do you define a migrant? How long do you have to be in the host country, and all these kind of things, right? And sometimes the definitions are inconsistent between countries, right? And maybe different definitions lead to different results. Now, if you have individual level high resolution data, right? If you really know me every time where I am, right? You can sort of bring your own definition to me, and you can sort of see how the global, migration patterns sort of change, right? For example, here, for the question, how long have you been in a certain location? Sort of, so here, if you look at this, sort of, here's a one duration, here's a longer duration. Depending on the duration you're considering, right? Maybe for this duration, you would assign this user to be in the red country, but if you have a different definition, he's in the blue country, right? Sort of depending on what you sort of use, right? If these are sort of the countries they're in at a given time, as inferred from Twitter, right? Or you can ask, where was your residence 3 years ago, or 5 years ago, or 10 years ago? And again, sort of depending on sort of this, right, what you sort of ask, you come up with different results, right? And so here, I think that was somewhat methodologically interesting to just explore, like how do the different duration definitions and the different interval definitions affect what you come up with, right? So I think it's sort of interesting from a methodological point of view. Again, this is other work, again, a bit more, less on the sort of numeric side, a bit more on the sort of qualitative side, where we look at changes in social networks, right? So maybe just show you this live. So there are websites such as FollowerWonk, where you can sort of see somebody's social network. In this case, this is the distribution of my followers for followers that have on Twitter that have the location in their bio, right? And what we're interested now is how does this network change, right, as somebody moves, right? So maybe what did it look like before I moved to Qatar? What did it look like after I moved to Qatar? Right? In this case, it's the same image, right? And so for this, you need to be able to monitor Twitter's users' social network across time, which is possible. So there's work done this because the Twitter API reports your followers in reverse chronological order. And so with some trickery, you can actually establish timestamps of when you started to follow somebody. Happy to talk more about that later, right? So this is now sort of something how does your social network change after you move. Maybe just one other thing on Twitter, just quickly, if you're interested in this. The same platform, FollowerWonk, also lets you search users, not tweets, but users by their self-declared location. So here you see, hopefully you can read this, Warsaw or Warsaw in Polish, right? So where you now sort of see these are users who have this sort of location. So if you want a sample, non-random sample, of course, right? But if you want to have a sample of some Twitter users who probably are in Warsaw, right? So you get this set, which is very male-dominated, if I may say so. But it's another sort of thing. Great. Okay, 5 minutes. So very quickly, sort of, yeah. So we used Google Plus data in the past. As you know, Google Plus probably no longer around. It was a sort of social network that Google used. But what was interesting here is that you had sort of not just from two, but co-lived countries, like a set. Right? So not just one sort of origin destination, but a whole bag of countries. And so we looked at which bags are more likely than expected, right? So maybe just quickly explain this. So even if you know that a lot of people have lived in Spain and France as pairs, and Spain and Italy as pairs, and France and Italy as pairs, still the triple appears more often than you would expect, right? So there's sort of something that this is like a positively boosted triple. I don't know how to say it's like a cluster. On the other hand, even though quite a few people have lived in Brazil and Mexico, and Brazil and US, or Mexico and US sort of pairwise, the triple is not as likely as you would expect, right? So this is sort of like a sort of higher orders of migration patterns. So it's sort of like a beyond, so we call it migration clusters, right? Beyond corridors to sort of clusters, right? So it's sort of interesting, just again, from a methodological point of view. But again, sort of, it's one of those, you can't do this anymore, it's no longer there. LinkedIn advertising data, yeah, maybe I'll show this very quickly, right? So similar to Facebook, you can look at LinkedIn. So LinkedIn users who are living in Bavaria, who are female, who studied in, right? So one of the universities in Warsaw, hopefully this is visible use, sort of. So no, sorry. Okay, the resolution is too poor. Okay, you have to trust me that this is just a bunch of universities in Warsaw, right? So I'm targeting LinkedIn users who are now living in Bavaria, but who used to live in Warsaw. And then again, same as with Facebook. So there's a number up here that says 450 users, right? So I can sort of, again, I don't know if these are Polish people, right? I mean, maybe these are people from Russia who studied in Poland, but again, it sort of tells me something about migration. So you can sort of create these plots, right? So people who studied in the UK, and so you can sort of see who's a net benefiter or contributor, right? So there are more people studying in the UK than sort of ending up working there, and sort of other countries, Germany, kind of the other way around, for example. Yahoo IP addresses, again, I used to be at Yahoo 10 years ago. Again, if you have, based on your IP address, if you check your email provider knows where you are. If you know this information for hundreds of millions, if not billions of users, you can sort of create, migration estimates. And one problem, if you do this naively, is what you sort of see here, is that especially, I mean, again, we did this sort of like 12 years ago or something, especially at that point, the sampling of older Yahoo users would almost surely oversample more mobile users. So if you then from their mobility rates, generalize to everybody in that age group, you think, oh, actually older people are more mobile than they actually are. So you have to sort of correct for the linkage between, lower internet penetration oversampling higher mobility rates, right? So this is then what this does sort of here. And so we did this to come up with out-migration rates for the US, for which there's not a lot of good data. My migration into the US is monitored reasonably well, but out-migration, not so much. But again, so I'm no longer at Yahoo, and Yahoo, I mean, I guess as email is still around, but it's certainly no longer as accessible to outside researchers. Google Trends, I'm sure you're familiar with this, so just FYI, it's not my work, others are sort of working on this. Textual content, you can look at, whether people talk about violence or sort of so, and how is that predictive of forced migration. Again, not my work, but just to mention it, there's other sort of maybe relevant. So Google location history, this is also an interesting paper that came out a couple of years ago. No, not a couple of years ago, I think earlier this year even, or not too long ago, right? So if you haven't seen this, so on Google, right, I'm opting in to share my location, right? So really on a given day, right, Google knows where I was at 5:45 in the morning and where I was sort of in the evening, and I'm opting in to share this data with Google. And then if you have such data for, again, 300 million users, you can actually come up with estimates around mobility. Facebook is also sharing data, or used to share data, in particular related to COVID-19, right? Sort of also through their Data for Good initiative. There's also very great people behind that project, but also displacement maps and a lot of interesting data that was accessible there. But again, this black box sort of changes, right? So they announced that they are sort of for now retiring these products and no longer updating them. So hopefully there'll be something new coming out of the Data for Good initiative. But for now, this is gone. Okay, and then I have 2 minutes to wrap up. Okay, so quick sort of recap. I know it was quite fast, so hopefully I think the value is relatively clear, right? So it's fast, it's cheap, almost global coverage. It's very versatile, right? You can do a lot of different things with this sort of data, right? So great, right? But hopefully it's also clear that it's not, it's certainly far from perfect, right? So first it's very volatile, right? So as you saw, right, both platforms themselves change as well as the usage of those platforms, even if the platforms don't change at all, right? I mean, now younger people are moving to whatever, Snapchat, TikTok, and other sort of platforms, right? So you have to sort of adapt to this, right? It's definitely very non-representative and also noisy, right? You have fake accounts and all these sort of different things that you have to worry about, right? Black box, hopefully that was clear, right? I don't know exactly how Facebook infers where somebody has lived, right? We can speculate about this. Privacy and informed consent can be unclear, right? Like sort of so, like do people really understand what's possible with their data, right? Like even on Twitter, sort of is open. Or what does informed consent even mean for satellite imagery, right? I mean, can you opt in to have your car not being taken a picture of, right? I mean, what does it even mean, right? In these sort of contexts, sort of, right? And there's also a risk of group level harm, right? Because I mean, I showed you where the Nepali are in Qatar. Okay, there's maybe no risk there, but you could imagine that I could identify other minorities in other contexts where the government might actually take some not so favorable action, right? So there's certainly risk there. yeah, so thank you very much. I'd be happy to discuss also during the coffee break, or otherwise feel free to reach out by email.